Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back to the show Jacquie Luqman, who's a coordinator of the Mid-Atlantic region and member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. Jacquie, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
So I want to start, I'm actually pulling from a Liberation School article here from October 11th that writes, quote, "The Black Panther Party was a supporter of the Palestinian struggle." In his article on the Middle East, BPP co-founder Huey P. Newton stated, quote, "We support the Palestinians' just struggle for liberation 100%. We will go on doing this, and we would like for all of the progressive people of the world to join our ranks in order to make a world in which all people can live," end quote. And so, Jacquie, I wanted to ask you about this, because one of the things that the U.S. is really good at is making us all goldfish and not remembering, or really not learning in the first place, our history. And I wanted to touch on how movements for liberation in the United States, particularly Black liberation, have always supported other movements for liberation around the world. And that includes, of course, Palestine. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that specific connection between those two movements.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long relationship in struggle against the same enemy, colonialism and imperialism. When we look at the article that Malcolm X wrote in an Egyptian newspaper called Zionist Logic in, I forget the year. I always forget the year, but I think it was in the 60s. He talked about that Zionism is colonialism. And he specifically says that Israeli Zionists are convinced they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. Their colonialism appears to be more benevolent, more philanthropic, a system with which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. And then he goes on to say the modern 20th century weapon of neo-imperialism is dollarism. The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, the ability to come posing as a friend and benefactor, bearing gifts and all other forms of economic aid and offers of technical assistance. Thus, the power and influence of Zionist Israel in many of the newly independent African nations has become even more unshakable than that of the 18th century European colonialists. And this new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. And this is Malcolm X saying all those decades ago that Zionism is, first of all, it's not only not a legitimate ideology, it is colonialism. It is colonialism. And I've been saying this over the past couple of days since October 7th has unfolded and people have taken to the streets in support of Palestine. I've started saying that Zionism is white supremacist settler colonialism with a Star of David draped over it, as a facade, and kind of forgetting that Malcolm X said the same thing, but in a lot greater detail, and pointing out the fact that Zionism is nothing but colonialism with the Star of David as a facade, unfortunately, because Eleanor, when we look at history and many of our revolutionaries, our revolutionary forefathers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Kwame Ture, Amilcar Cabral, so many of our forerunners who we base our get our strength and get our grounding in this struggle from, correctly and honestly assessed the history of Palestine and the creation of Israel. And they understood even then in the 60s, in the 50s, that Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism is a cynical, as I said, white supremacist, settler colonial ideology that is nothing but a cover for stealing the land of Palestinian people. And it's unfortunate. Well, actually, it's criminal and it's genocidal. That's what it still is. That this facade has not been cracked to sufficiently enough to defend and uphold the humanity and the dignity of the Palestinian people. Because what has happened is that people in this country, in another white supremacist settler colonial project, have been able to wholesale accept that Israel is surrounded by enemies and that the Palestinians hate them and want to kill them all. And all of the Arab nations surrounding Israel wants Israel to just not exist because they are Jewish. Not understanding that the opposition to the modern state of Israel is that it is a settler colony. It is a white supremacist settler colonial project, and brings with it all of the ethnic cleansing and violence and genocide that settler colonial projects do by definition. So when we look at the history, the unfortunate thing that is missed, that is glossed over by these lies about Israel is innocent and they're unprovoked, they're attacked unprovoked in an unprovoked manner by Palestine and enemies on all sides, and everyone wants to push Israel into the sea. The history that's missed is that Muslims throughout history were the ones who welcomed exiled Jews, who were and exiled non-Orthodox Christians, by the way, who were repeatedly exiled or ethnically cleansed from that very same region by the Orthodox Christian rulers since before Constantine. But since we're talking about Christianity as a concept, we'll stick it at Constantine. So ever since Constantine decided to make Christianity the official religion of Rome, then the Roman empires repeatedly expelled Christians, non-Orthodox Christians, and Jews and Muslims from the territories they occupied. Palestine was one of those territories, and that region repeatedly throughout the hundreds of years of history of Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together in that region. Every time the Orthodox Christians came along, whether it was Constantine or the French with the Crusades, and either expelled all of the Muslims and Jews or killed everyone, as many as they could, whenever a Muslim ruler came along after them, one of the first things they did was usually to welcome the exiled communities back into Jerusalem and Palestine proper. That has been proven throughout history. So unfortunately, because the Zionist project has such great lobbyists, Eleanor, and they have such a fantastic PR campaign, I think the Zionist entity has a PR apparatus that is second in efficacy only to the US media. I don't see any other entity being able to prop up a lie as well and as long as the Zionists have in the way they have caricatured the Palestinian people, Muslims in general, and all of the Arab nations surrounding Palestine as if they're just singularly focused on destroying Israel because they're Jews and they just hate Jews. No, people hate settler colonialism. People hate the fact that a bunch of folks from Europe decided to come in and say that because God said that he would promise this land to us, it's within our right to not only come and settle here, but to take land from the indigenous people who have been here for thousands of years, Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in Palestine alike, who always have been there. And yeah, people take offense to that. And of course, they take offense to the weaponization of their own faith traditions as if they are intrinsically evil compared to this manufactured light that these European settler colonialists bring in their ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people. That's what people oppose in regard to Israel. People aren't angry, because I'm not going to say that there are not some people who hate Jews. Of course there are. But the primary opposition of Palestinians, of people in the Arab world, and certainly of African people in the United States, in our opposition to Israel, it's the settler colonialism. It's the settler colonialism that we have seen in the establishment of this piece of stolen land. Oh, stop. Sorry. In this piece of stolen land, it's the theft of homes and land that we understand Europeans did here with indigenous people and with our ancestors. It is the sterilization of women, of an undesirable population that Israel has done with Ethiopian Jews. Now, these were Jewish people but they sterilized the African Jews because they're not because they're Jewish, but because they're African. And so we understand that is white supremacy. You know, we understand the imprisoning of people for standing up for their right to live, for standing up against apartheid. We understand that's connected to the struggle of apartheid in South Africa, the jailing of children, the killing of children. That's also connected to the struggle of apartheid in South Africa, where it was an uprising of students that really brought the struggle in South Africa to the forefront of the consciousness of the world, because the South African army, what did they do? They gunned down a bunch of children. So there are so many historical connections to African liberation that our forefathers and foresisters and foremothers made in this struggle for liberation, that everything we do, I mean, even before October 7th, we've been talking about Palestine. You know, we talked about Palestine consistently on By Any Means Necessary. In the church I belong to, by Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, we are liberation theology Christians. We talk about Palestine, and we have been talking about them for years, and we always talk about Palestine in the context of people's struggle against oppression, occupation, colonization, and ethnic cleansing and genocide. That is a common theme and thread throughout all people's struggles. And certainly that's something that our history as a people, the history of indigenous people in this country, and the history of African struggle definitely connects with our Palestinian cousins.
Absolutely. And I definitely appreciate that connection to people, Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Palestine long before. I mean, Jewish people started immigrating from fleeing the pogroms in the 1880s to Palestine, not as Zionists, as Jews. And so I think that is necessarily cut off from the discussion when Zionists, give this argument, because that would fly in the face of their need to be. And I also appreciate you talking about how the system is malleable with regards to how it presents itself. And I wanted to ask you about that too, because one of the things that has been making the rounds on the interwebs is the video of a Black IDF soldier. And there have also been people sharing videos, and there was like a Black Zionist on Instagram who was talking about how important she feels that Zionism is as a Black Jewish person. And it reminds me, of course, of like, you know, the press secretary for Biden, you know, this idea, Kamala Harris, this idea of how malleable the system is with regards to the people it can set forth as spokespersons for the system, even though they are the marginalized groups. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how Zionism, just like other settler colonialist ideologies, used some of the most oppressed people to support their message.
Yeah, I mean, it's transactional, right? It's bad enough that any group of people thought it was a good idea to go to a whole nother country and steal it from people who were already there. Because they were fleeing oppression, which absolutely Jews needed a place, a safe haven from the horrific oppression and persecution that was going on in Europe. Absolutely, that's true. But instead of living in peace with people in Palestine, Zionists decided, and living in peace, as you pointed out, Eleanor, and I'm glad you did, with people in Palestine who welcomed them because they knew they were fleeing persecution. And they knew they needed a safe place to stay. And they opened their arms and said, okay, fine. Yes, you're safe here. But instead of living in peace with those people, they decided to come and take over everything. That's bad enough when an oppressed people does that to another group of people. It's even worse when among that oppressed group of people, there is a subset of another group of oppressed people who are oppressed by the oppressors themselves. Because Black Jews, African Jews, as I pointed out, in the case of the Ethiopians, are subjected to racial discrimination in Israel because Israel is a white supremacist state. So just because they are in the IDF, the Israeli military, I'm not going to call them the defense fund because there's no defense for what are they defending? They're defending settler colonialism, and that's not legitimate. But Black Jews who are serving in the Israeli military I look at it as a transactional kind of thing. It's like, I'll do this for you. I'll do your bidding if you don't discriminate against me so much. I think that's the easiest way, because people, I think, have a hard time wrapping their heads around the fact that African descended people can be white supremacists too. Just like women can adhere to male chauvinism, and sexism. Black people can be white supremacists. Black people can be settler colonists. I mean, when we look at even in Haiti, with the president of Kenya volunteering to lead an invasion into Haiti, an African leader willingly leading an invasion into another African country. Why would he do that? Because he's doing the bidding of the people who pay him. He is put in power. The president of Kenya is put in power by Western imperialists. The same is true, I think, to a degree in regard to these the black faces of Zionism that we're seeing on social media. They are put forth by this Zionist project to do two things: to say, see, Israel isn't white supremacist. We're not racist. Look, we got Black Jews. Look at that. And then to further convince Black Americans, well, I hesitate to say that, but Black people in America, that we should align ourselves with Zionist Israel, that our cause and that our affinity and solidarity should not be with the Palestinians, because look, these crazy Arabs are attacking your Black brothers and sisters over here in Israel. That's what this is. And it's I'm not going to say that the Israeli government has paid these people to do it. I think these people, just by virtue of the fact that they are there and they have willingly decided to live in Israel, to be complicit in stealing land, the land of the Palestinian people, and oppressing the Palestinian people, that makes them complicit, because that is why I've also been saying there's no such thing as an innocent settler. There's no such thing as someone who is involved in the settler colonial project in any aspect who is innocent, because settler colonialism by definition is a violent, genocidal process. And it doesn't stop. It doesn't have a beginning and an end, settler colonialism. It's not like they reach a point of, critical mass of this many people that they want gone, and they're like, okay, we'll back up. No. Settler colonialism is an ongoing project. And we could just look at the United States. We could just look at Europe and its former colonies in Africa and see that that's true. So people, anyone who decides to live in Israel is partaking in the settler colonial project. And I think I have to say that, yes, that is different from people who live in the United States, people like me and our ancestors, because we didn't ask to come here. I mean, we were brought here, and when we wanted to leave, we were told we couldn't. So we couldn't. We weren't allowed to fight in the independence and liberation struggles of our people back home. So in that way, we are also colonized here. We're held captive here, and we always have been. So people who choose to move to Israel because they believe that is the God-ordained homeland for Jewish people, they're not participating in some magnificent religious revival. They're participating in a settler colonial project, and that includes Black people who are Jews who move to Israel because they are Jews and they think that is their home. They are doing as much usurping and land theft and ethnic cleansing as a European settler is doing, particularly when they are in the Israeli military and they're carrying out the orders against the indigenous population at the behest of the Zionist white supremacist settler colonial Israeli government. So these Black faces of Zionism are no different from the Kamala Harrises and the Congressional Black Caucuses, the Hakeem Jeffries in this country, the Lloyd Austins, the Susan Rices, who are the Black faces of imperialism, warmongering, and bloodthirsty U.S. militarism all around the world. It's the same strain of ideology, and that they're excellent propaganda tools. But I think they're willing, excellent propaganda tools, because the heat is taken off of them a little bit in exchange for their complicity in this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's similar to, Black cops in the United States. Well, they're not going to be the Black person that's then killed by the cops because they are the cop.
Right.
So that's convenient. And I wanted to ask, because I think this is a point that that sometimes gets I don't know if the word is gummy or sticky or whatever, but that settler, like, there is no innocent settler. And I think this is a really interesting conversation, because I was having I've been doing these talks with fellow Jews, and how do we as Jewish people approach this, particularly with family members who grew up feeling that Zionism was necessary for our survival. And one of the things that we've had a conversation about is that I am, as somebody who is not indigenous to the United States, I'm the child of immigrants. My mom came here in the 80s. My dad was first generation born in the United States. I am technically a settler in that sense. And so I am also participating in the continued subjugation of indigenous peoples in the United States by living here. And how does that compare or contrast to what's going on in Israel? And how can we also talk about the defense of the Palestinian people vis-a-vis fighting back for their own survival? How can we talk about that while understanding that the settler colonial project is in and of itself a violence? And how would you say that compares to, for instance, me living here as somebody who's not of the African diaspora and not of the indigenous population here?
That's a really great question, because I think here is where we do get to talk about the history, right? It's like, when we talk about immigration in this country, it's always very political, and it's always, the kind of immigrants we do want and the kind of immigrants we don't want, and do you immigrate the right way or the wrong way? And the people leading this conversation, Eleanor, are always people whose ancestors literally stole this country. Right? There are people, they're always talking about, well, we have to have people who immigrate here the right way. And they're always people whose ancestors came through Ellis Island with a barely legible piece of paper with no documentation outside of that. And they're talking about, so it's an opportunity to bring up the illegitimacy of the conversation and the people who are controlling the conversation around immigration in this country in the first place. Because then, of course, we have to get to the part about, oh, and by the way, the very people who are trying to control this conversation about immigration and control immigration itself, they haven't gotten the opinion of the people who really suffered negatively by all of that illegal immigration. Do you understand? So it's, for me, because the settler colonial project, until this system is destroyed and we build something better for the people, the settler colonial project is ongoing. So I think it is a moment, and I don't want people to mistake or think that now is the time that we get to condemn people, because you're all settlers, and that's not, that's neither entirely accurate, but it's also not very helpful. It's not helpful in advancing liberation. But this is the time. These are the kinds of conversations where we have a great and really unique opportunity. And I really don't see any other way that we have these conversations, Eleanor, with our non-organizing family members and friends, to have these conversations connecting these issues of the indigenous people on this land, how they were disenfranchised by settler colonialism, how European immigration was seen and treated differently, and how it still is, compared to how immigration from other groups of people, Haitians, Africans, Cubans and Venezuelans of a certain political persuasion, how they are used by the continuing settler colonial government of this country, or of this project rather, and the struggle for African liberations. Why do African radicals consider themselves African and not American? Why are we saying we're fighting for liberation in a country that we're supposed to be citizens of, right? I don't see another time in all of the organizing that we do, all of the time, that we can have this very unique and very important conversation connecting all of these things, making clear to people what this country is, and helping them understand what Palestinians are fighting and why they're fighting. I don't see a better time for us to be able to do this with people who are not already involved in these struggles. Because the truth is, our families and our friends, I'll tell you the way my dad tells me all the time. My dad is a minister. He's an elder in the Church of God in Christ. My dad is not radical. He's not. He's really not. I think I have been able to convince him of some things politically, but there are some religious things, spiritual things, biblical things that I'm never gonna. I'm just not. So because of that, there are some things we don't talk about, right? Because we're just never going to agree. But if I can sit down with my dad and explain to him these things and have him say to me, you know what? I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you because you just tell the truth the way you see it. And even if people don't agree, it's important enough to you that you just tell them the truth anyway. And for a lot of our friends and family members, co-workers, church members, dear God, we've got to just, that's a whole nother battle right there. But if we can get that in these conversations from people in this moment, seizing this moment where we are watching a righteous liberation struggle of a people play out before our very eyes. And although people around the world have been rising up against colonialism and imperialism in some way, from Peru to Mali to Guinea-Bissau, to Atlanta, to Baltimore with, Cop City and all over the place, there is something different about this moment. I wish I could put a finger on what it is that's different. I don't know what it is that's different, other than maybe for the only time since maybe Rwanda, the world is watching a genocide take place, like on the evening news, right? And people are being forced to take a side, right? Whether they're being personally confronted with doing that or not. And I think we should personally confront people about where they stand on this issue. And when they tell us they stand with Israel, then it's our responsibility to tell them you're wrong, and this is why. So those conversations are not going to, everybody's not going to agree. Everybody isn't going to agree. A lot of people are still going to stand with Israel because the propaganda has been so deep and so long and so effective. A lot of people will continue to believe that Israel is the victim and that Palestinians are the aggressors and the anti-Semites, although Palestinians are Semitic people themselves. Yeah, that's another thing. But we're not going to be able to undo the indoctrination, the very effective and insidious Zionist indoctrination, with one or two conversations. But if we can get a few people to respond like my dad did and say, you know what, I'm proud of you. Or, okay, I understand. I didn't know that. If I can get from people, oh, I didn't know that, when I tell them about some of this history, that's a victory. That's getting people one step farther away from the propaganda and the lies, and one step closer to joining the struggle for liberation. That's how I look at it. I look at it in a very incremental, one day at a time kind of way, because we are living in times that I think are unprecedented in the hope that we should be having for people's liberation and for the demise of colonialism and imperialism and capitalism. But because we're that much closer to the demise of those systems, these times are that much more dangerous. So I kind of measure how I attack dealing with continuing this struggle. I can't look at it 5-10 years down the line. I can look at, did I do enough today? Did I do enough today to fight for the liberation of humanity away from these oppressive systems. Have I done enough today? That's how I look at it.
And I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. And I love the idea of, you got to meet people where they're at, right? Which is also why when I've been speaking to fellow Jews, I use a lot of Jewish teachings, because our teachings are inherently anti-Zionist, because they're inherently anti-oppressive. So I think that, like I was sending my dad rabbinical statements that were like anti-Zionist, like use tools that speak to people. Like if somebody were to send me something trying to make a point that was made by like some radical queer Jewish person, I'd be like, okay, I'm listening,
Exactly.
You gotta, yeah. And I feel like I could talk to you for days, which is always the case. But finally, like in just a couple of minutes, I know that this is ridiculous, but I wanted to get in just one last question, because I really appreciate the work that you do has so much of an internationalist perspective and Pan-Africanism, which I've learned a lot about from you and folks like Netfa Friedman. But like, how can we take a page from that book in terms of, screw borders? They're like, no, the powers that be don't care. And so liberation must be collective. How can we take that perspective on what's happening now so as to link it to all of the struggles that we are facing collectively?
Well, when you look at it in just a material sense, when we look at the Israeli military, we understand it, for people who didn't know, that there are lots of police departments in the United States that go to Israel and are trained by the Israeli military. And they train them in these repressive, violent techniques that the Israeli military uses against Palestinians, that the US police forces come back here and use on us. This is absolutely true of the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C., that has a budget of $500,000, $500,000, and homeless people are just, the homeless population is exploding because people cannot afford to live in this city. And this is true across the country. City councils, mayors, lots of Democratic city councils and mayors are always still voting to increase funding for police, to continue to prop up the 1033 program that takes surplus military equipment from the Pentagon, that gives them to local police departments to use against us on the streets, people fighting against this repression, people fighting against racist police terrorism, people fighting against the proliferation of cop cities, right? So that's the connection with Palestine there. And Palestinians have, when George Floyd was publicly lynched, Palestinians rose up in support of George Floyd and Black lives snuffed out by racist police terrorism. In the 2020 uprisings, it was Palestinians who reached out to Black folks in the streets to help us learn how to mitigate tear gas, the effects of tear gas while we're out protesting. Tear gas that is provided to the Israeli military by the United States government. And the same United States military that is giving weapons and training and all of this lethal material support to the Zionist government in Israel is the same government that props up AFRICOM to militarize Africa and suppress populations of people rising up against neocolonialism and imperialism there, in the Congo, in Mali, in Guinea-Bissau, in Nigeria, all over the place on the continent. This is the same militarism that is backing a coup government in Peru, in Dina Boluarte. This is the same settler colonial government, the US government, and its militarism that is ratcheting up a war against China over Taiwan, which is a part of China. And this is the same US government that started the proxy war using Ukraine against Russia, and then turned around and demonized everyone in the US that told the truth about this being a proxy war in Ukraine started by the US, the EU, and NATO, and said that we were all agents of Putin. We were all Putin's puppets. So the same government, the same settler colonial white supremacist government in this country exports its ideology, its capitalist oppression, its militarism, and its just crushing of people's movements all around the world. That's the international connection. We're not just fighting against one government. We're fighting against the head of the snake, Eleanor. And the head of the snake is the United States government. That's the internationalism that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker and Amilcar Cabral and Thomas Sankara and Samora Machel and Maurice Bishop and that is the internationalism that we continue our struggle founded on.
That's what a powerful and important way to end this conversation. Jacquie, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Where can folks follow your work?
I can be found now on Black Power Media exclusively, since you know what happened.
I do.
So I can be found, Luqman Nation can be found on Black Power Media on YouTube, and you can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/Luqman Nation, LuqMannation.
Thank you so much, Jacquie. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate you so much. Thanks.